Hey everyone, Vessel here. I wanted to go over the results from the river problem scoring and talk about some of the things that people are doing well, people are not doing well, and hopefully give you some tips here as we move through the course. So these were the results from Part A for Student 1. It looked like 50% of people picked partially correct, 49.1 picked essentially correct, and a small portion picked incorrect. So really split on this issue of comparing the distributions. So I want to sort of help out with this particular idea. So basically, what I wanted you to see was, well, the reading here. So it says the river X has the largest median, and Y the second. Range of X is larger than Y's, larger than 2 times Z's. That's a weird sentence, isn't it? The IQR of X is larger than the range of Z. X is skewed to the right, Y is roughly symmetric, and Z is skewed to the left. There is no outlier in each of the three rivers. So one of the things I wanted to point out was when a student does a response for these things and it says compare, the things you need to compare are shape, outlier, center, and spread. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to scroll up for a second to the scoring guidelines here. They have to describe in context center, spread, and shape. So these three things need to be there in order to get full credit. And it does not mention outliers. Outliers are just something that I want you to get in the habit of doing every single time. You see the word compare, outliers need to be a part of that process. And in this particular response, the outlier section here, there is no outlier. So this kid, again, this was 10 years ago where a student would have been responding to this response. There is no outlier. The reason they know that there are no outliers, there's no asterisks anywhere, and there's no indication of outliers. So this sentence is a good thing to have here, though it wasn't even scored in this particular question. So, this doesn't hurt, nor does it help the response here. There is no outlier. River X is the largest median, Y the second. So what the student is looking at is that River X right here, the median, you can see it in the box plot. Y is a little bit lower, and Z is the lowest. So if River X has the largest median and Y has the second, this does meet criteria for comparing medians because it says X is the biggest, Y is the second, which also must mean Z is the lowest. So this does meet, this first sentence checks off the box for saying center is met. The range of X is larger than the range, or larger than Y's. So the range represents this calculation. They didn't say what the numbers are. You don't have to check numbers, but range is this distance from maximum minus minimum. It's really easy to see range in a box plot. You can quickly tell that river X is the largest range. River Y, concentrations of aldrin, is in the middle, and Z has the smallest range. And that's indicated in this particular sentence. The fact that this kid says it's larger than 2 times Z's is fine. It doesn't hurt the response. I think what they're saying is like the range for Z is half as much as river X. Again, it's not necessary to mention this 2 times factor, but Z has the lowest range. And then the next part of the sentence is that IQR of X is larger than the range of Z. So IQR is the gap between the boxes, basically. So Q1 is here, Q3 is here. This middle 50%, that's what the IQR is. You can easily get a visual of in a box plot. So the middle 50% is the largest for river X, and it's the smallest for river Z. And that's basically what, this particular sentence says the IQR of X is larger than the range of Z. And that's fine. It's not wrong. Again, you don't need to go into all this detail. And I think the biggest piece of advice that I'd mention for this is if you did some of this stuff in Algebra D, you might have done many, many, many different comparisons and calculations. This student needs to do, where is it? Right here. In order to get full credit, they have to mention center, spread, and shape for all three characteristics in all of the three distributions and make a comparative statement. So does this kid do that? Does this kid mention spread? So this kid mentions spread in two ways, range and IQR. And they're doing comparative. They're saying larger. All that means is that it's larger than river Y, larger than 2 times Z. So this meets criteria for range. It meets comparison criteria. And then finally, shape. X is skewed to the right. Y is roughly symmetric. Z is skewed to the left. Now, the thing that I would caution about box plots. So in general, box plots are great if you need to see a quick median, you need IQR, you want to see range. Box plots are fantastic for that. Box plots are really difficult to see shape, and we'll see that kind of in part B. But it is correct to say that X, I don't like the phrasing, is skewed to the right. I think that's a little bit too strong of a phrase. Y is roughly symmetric. I like that better. Roughly symmetric means it's fairly balanced. So how you look for shape in these things is that if this line from the median over to Q3, if it's longer toward the right, and from the median to the maximum, if that's a longer segment, this is a good indication that it might be skewed to the right. You see how river Y is fairly balanced because the median is kind of in the middle of the box. And, you know, there is a longer line segment toward the left right here than there is to the right. But it is more symmetric. And again, I like the way that the student said roughly. It's okay to use soft language here. You don't need to be so committal to this that it is a fact. Box plots are tough to see shape. With river Z, you can see like this is likely, and this student says is skewed. I like the phrase likely. It's likely skewed to the left because you have this longer box here and this longer line here than on the right side. So the fact that this kid said is skewed to the left, it's a little bit strong of a language for my preference, but it does do the job. It is likely that river X is skewed to the right, Y is likely symmetric, and river Z is likely skewed to the left. Now, other questions or other problems that we'll do throughout this course is easier to see shape. Box plots, main point of this thing, and we'll see this in the next parts, it is really tough to see shape in a box plot. But this kid does the stuff that's necessary for full credit. They mention measure of center, median, and they compare it. X is the biggest, Y is the second. They do spread, range. X is larger than Y and larger than Z. It even does a little bit of IQR. So both of these things make spread. And then it does shape. X is skewed to the right, Y is roughly symmetric, Z is skewed to the left. And there is no outlier in each of the three rivers. So here's the question that we have to ask ourselves. Does it do center, shape, and spread? And the answer to that is yes. Is it something that we think is perfect? No, I think this kid could have done a better job in terms of answering this question, but they do everything they need to do when it says compare. Center, shape, spread, and they even do a sentence about outliers. So this is correct, and the only thing that I think is sometimes difficult to infer is did they mention the context? They could do a better job of context because what this whole thing is about is concentrations of Aldrin. And they mentioned river X, 3 rivers. This was scored essentially correct because 3 rivers with river mentioned a few times is enough of a context to just sort of the graders that if they had this response, you get a pretty good sense for what these rivers box plots might have looked like. So this was essentially correct. So 41.1% of the group picked the correct score for here. Next one is the part B, river, the box or stem and leaf plot, for river X. And a lot of people picked essentially correct, some partial. Here's the real key. Mean 3/47 means that there are 2 data points, 3.4 and 3.7. And what I'd point out here is that this is really important. This key is fantastic. It's good to have the legend here that lets the grader know. Basically, what you want to be able to do is say, like, if you had this data set, does it match, or sorry, if you had this stem and leaf, could you recreate the data set? And you could if you had this data point, 3.4, 3.7 down here. One of the reasons that a lot of time people pick partial, I don't know if that happened here, but there are actually 2 mistakes in this particular stem and leaf plot. And most of the time people don't even notice it. It's, here's an example, 4.8 right here. 4.8 wasn't even in this display. There should be an 8 over here. So there are some mistakes. I think there's another one in this particular stem and leaf. So if a kid picks partial, totally understandable. But I'm going to go back up here to the scoring guide. You can mark it essentially correct if a reasonable stem plot, reasonable is a key word here, that includes a leaf unit is provided. It is not necessary for the key to include measurement units. So this was actually scored essentially correct because it was deemed reasonable. Seems like this student knows how to make a stem plot. They might have made a mistake in a particular data point, but it's not enough where this would be marked wrong. So this particular display was marked full credit, essentially correct. And even though I see why a kid might do partial, this is okay. And it would be okay in our class too. If a student makes a small mistake in a data point, it doesn't really mean that they don't know how to make a stem plot. So this particular thing, this small error is okay here. And then the final part, part C, there is a gap from 5.6 to 7.3, and we can see it in the stem plot, but not in the box plot. 79, almost 80% said, yep, that's perfectly fine. 17% said partial credit. If I go back up here to the scoring guide, essentially correct is if the response includes a recognition of the gap in the stem plot and gives an indication of where the gap occurs, or if it comments on bimodality, which means 2 peaks or 2 clusters, and specifies where those clusters occur. This kid did a perfectly fine job saying there is a gap from 5.6 to 7.3. This is essentially correct, full credit in this case. So to summarize, student 1 should have been essentially correct, and then another essentially correct here, and then a third essentially correct. This kid got full credit for their response. All right, on to student B. So this one, very different approach. You can tell right away that this kid organized things in a very different way. They wrote center and had a bunch of stuff here. Range, bunch of stuff. Shape, bunch of stuff. And then there's even a sentence about outliers. You know, quick contrast. This student did not do that. He wrote a 1 sentence about medians, 1 sentence about range and IQR, and then 1 about shape. Sometimes students find part student B more appealing because it's organized in a more efficient way. And really, it's totally fine. I definitely agree that student B did a really good job organizing stuff, but we still need to make sure that the content is there. So they have to make sure they compare. Let's take center for example. River X, largest. Look at this kid. He wrote mean, crossed it off, and then put median. And that little thing might be a insignificant, seemingly insignificant item, but it's really important that they use median here. It is not okay to just say the center for River X is largest or mean. That's not what's true. What we know, this number right here, that's the median. So it's really important that you say median. You need to be specific in your measure of center. And then even give a value, 5.2. River Z has the smallest median, which is approximately 4.4. River Y has a median of 5. So do they say which one's larger? Well, not really. Well, they do here, I guess. But they give the values. So if it's easy, here's my advice. If it's easy to give the actual value, just do it. And you can quickly tell that X is the biggest, Y is the second, and Z is the smallest median. They did a good job of units, so this is in context. And they even give values. And if it's easy to do that, I recommend it. And then they talk about range. River X, Y, and Z has a range of approximately 5.2, 3.4, and 2.1 respectively. So they're basically doing a quick calculation for what is the width. of x, y, and z for the maximum minus the minimum. And perfectly fine here. They did a good job with that. This indicates that river X has the widest range and Z has the narrowest range. So right away they're saying, they're comparing them. X is largest, Y is second, Z is smallest, and they even give the values. You know, the values aren't vital, but they did it here, and it's perfectly fine. I would probably recommend writing the word spread here over range, but they've done a good job. They've met the criteria, so center is met, and spread is also met. Over here, you'll see shape. Shape of distribution of river X is skewed to the right, while river Y is roughly symmetric. River Z shows a distribution that is slightly skewed to the left. None of the distributions have outliers. So they've done outliers. It's not graded in this particular case, but it's true. There are no outliers. What's really important here is they've done shape and they've described distribution X as skewed to the right, roughly symmetric, and slightly skewed to the left. Again, box plots are really tough to see shape. And we'll see that in the next, I want to point that out in the next part here. But they've done a good job of doing shape, center, and spread. And they also did outliers, which is really, really good here. This one was scored essentially correct. So 71.9% of you picked correctly. It is essentially correct. Here, I was noticing 63% said partial, 34% said essential. It has the numbers, it's correct in terms of the numbers compared to the last kid, but here's why this is partial. It's partially correct because they never mentioned the key. 3/4 might be 34. It might be 340. You don't know without saying some sort of key down here. So this actually, good to see, 63% picked correctly. It is partial. Here's the other thing that I want to point out. River X, right? So this particular display, and it's part of part C, you can see a clear gap and two clusters in the stem plot. You can see your cluster here. You can see your cluster here. Go back to this box plot. Turns out there is no data between 5.3, maybe 5.6, 5.6 and 7.3. And you can't see that in the river, or in the box plot of the river X. You can see it here. That's 5.6 to 7.3. No numbers between those. But you cannot see that in the box plot. This kid gets partial credit, which I see 78% noticed, because they don't say where. So it's good to see. You can see the clear gap in the two clusters. It's here. And you can see these two clusters. But if they don't say where, then this is going to score partial correct. So great job by the students here. 78% did a good job saying it's partial because they don't say where the gap or the clusters are. And then finally, student C. This one was really tough. It looked like almost an equal percentage picked essential, partial, and even 11% said incorrect. So what you look for here, this one here, from the box plot shown, we can conclude that the distribution of Aldrin for river X has the greatest range. So max minus min. It also has the greatest median and IQR. So what this kid did maybe is organize it in a terrible way. But what they're starting with is river X, biggest range. That's a good thing. It's talking about spread. And it also has the greatest median and IQR. So this kid did a really good job of center and spread to start. What about the distribution of concentration of Aldrin in river Z? Now, if you're ever asking yourself a rhetorical question in the middle of a response, it's probably not a good idea. But that aside, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't take away from this response. It doesn't help it either. But he's saying river Z has the lowest median, and the IQR also has the lowest range. So this kid is also mentioning a correct statement, median and IQR and range. So this kid does a pretty good job of talking about spread and center. And then finally it wraps up. The box plot of river Y's distribution is between river Z and river X. And basically, it's got a good job of shape. Sorry, it's got a good job of center and spread. What it's lacking is shape. It doesn't mention anything about the shapes of these distributions. I'm going to go back to your scoring guide for a second. Does it mention all three distributions? Yes, it does. It mentions X, Y, and Z. Does it correctly describe at least two of the characteristics, center, spread, and shape, of at least two distributions? Yes, it does. It mentions center for river X and Y and Z, and it measures spread for X, Y, and Z. What it lacks is shape. So there's nothing there about shape. And it concludes a correct comparison. It did that as well. This is by definition partial credit. So the students that picked, I'll go back to student C here, partial, there's 45.6%, correctly scored this one as partial. This one, another controversial grading, almost equally split between E and P here. This one, units and tenths. So if a kid wrote this as tenths, and again, here's your big litmus test. As long as you can read the stem plot and come back with this particular data set up here, you're actually in good shape. So 3 1/10, 0.4. The only way to read this is 3.4, 3.7, and so on. This one was actually scored essentially correct because of the fact that this kid labeled it tenths here. Is it my favorite representation? Not even close. I thought student A did a better job. Where is it? Here's student A. They did a really, really nice job of saying like 3/4 means 3.4 and 3.7. Like that was great. But actually, this kid does just as good of a job as being able to rewrite this data set from the stem plot. So this one was also scored essentially correct. So 49% of you got that one correct as well. The commas don't matter. Perfectly fine. Essentially correct. And then finally, this is 64% picked incorrect. From our stem plot, we can see that the graph of the distribution of the concentration of eldrin for river X is bell shape, has approximately a normal distribution, is also symmetric. Not one of these things is helpful toward the answer to this question. So it actually is, it's incorrect. They never mentioned that there is a cluster, two clusters, or the gap. That is incorrect. There is nothing here that helps answer this question here. So another one that's by far the most common way to get incorrect for this, and many of you did this as well, you said something like, you can see every data point in the stem plot, you cannot see that on the box plot. That's going to score incorrect every time. And this one's a different way to get incorrect. You have to mention the gap or these two clusters. You just cannot see that in a box plot. So that was the overall theme of this activity. Hopefully you found this helpful. And moving forward, we're going to get better at this. But thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.